know what's coming up next. So today we're here with Creating Momentum, the 24-hour rule, and we're going to talk a lot about dynamic documentation with Adrian. So really excited about today's session. It's practically a required session for Amplify employees because I think it's that important. So really, really excited to share the knowledge that Adrian's been putting together over many years and soon will be in a book. So we're going to talk to Adrian and get rolling with her. But before we do that, a couple quick things coming up just in general with AHA. So June 21st is our next AHA with Amplify after today. We're going to be looking at strategy, and I'm really excited that we've got Ben Trek and Peter joining us. And Peter actually is the strategy coach that Amplify uses. And as you can imagine, that would be a bit of a challenge, having a group like us, putting us in a disciplined room and focused and spending our days on strategy. So we actually had a couple of weeks ago, our executive committee, which includes Ryan that leads recruiting, and Jordan that's our chief growth officer, and Jesse, my co-founder, and myself, the four of us had 2 days with Peter and his team. And I think we managed to get him off track, even though he's very disciplined, but we got a lot out of it, and we're really excited to get rolling. And so we're happy to have him share his methodology and his approach to strategy with you on June 21st. He also has a proprietary software that's actually really relevant to what we're talking about today, in the sense that this software is designed for documentation and collaboration in regards to your executive and your team and your project meetings, that ties everything that you're doing on a weekly meeting basis to your quarterly strategy meetings and to your annual strategy meetings. So today's topic and a lot of what Adrian's talking about is going to be live and demoed with Peter's strategy software as one example of a way to use automation and technology to document, to follow up, and hold yourself accountable. So these two sessions really supplement and complement each other in a great way. So be sure to sign up if you haven't already for June 21st AHA with Amplify. It's the last of the season, and really, really excited that we've had such a great season, and for the most part, a post-COVID, not lockdown season, and really saw a lot of great attendees and a lot of new members with AHA. So thank you so much for your support of our program, and we'll be returning on the third Tuesday of most months in September. And at that point, rolling into a couple exciting ones that we're going to announce soon, including some wealth management. So we know that the business leaders and the CPAs that attend our AHA with Amplify have their own wealth and their own personal questions when it comes to money. And the irony is sometimes we're so busy looking at corporate money and corporate wealth and corporate financial health that we forget to spend a few minutes on our personal. So excited to bring a very, very reputable and great speaker when it comes to personal wealth management in the fall. We're also going to have an IFRS update because the CPAs demand it and they love it. And so we're going to beg and plead that Janice comes back and helps us with an IFRS update. And the business leaders probably don't want to attend that one. And a few other great topics. Always looking for feedback, always excited to hear what you'd like us to present. And we'll make sure to try and get presenters in regards to those topics too. I also have hot off the press, September 15th, we're going to have Dr. Howard Johnson, who's a very well-known M&A and valuations expert in the CPA, FEI, and small medium business world of Canada. He's going to join us from Toronto live. We'll have a live event on September 15th. So that'll be a really great opportunity for you to be in person with fellow AHA members, get a chance to learn about M&A and valuations from someone who's working in small medium business across the country, and brings that international and national perspective. So very excited to be announcing that September 15th, we have Dr. Howard Johnson joining us, and that'll be a live event. So there'll be limited seats. So make sure that you're registered, paying attention to AHA with Amplify emails, and taking a seat as soon as you get the chance, because it will be, the room will only be able to fit so many people. So not everybody that wants to see him speak will get the chance. So that's September 15th. And this is a fresh announcement. I don't even know if Jesse knows about it, but he's learning about it right now and today. So without further ado, Adrian, so excited to have you here. So we know Adrian in many ways. Actually, one of the three first business opportunities that Amplify had came through Adrian. She was so kind to support this desperate small business that wanted to get off the ground. And she said, hey, Jamie, bring in your team, do some IFRS lease accounting, help us with a project that is a little outside of risk oversight scope. Let's work together, let's partner, let's pair up. And that was one of the first 3 assignments that Amplify ever did back in 2018. So we are definitely in debt to Adrienne and her co-founder of Risk Oversight, because they let us, get the confidence that we could actually deliver client work and we could actually be a business without that Big Four brand name behind us. And so that was an incredible opportunity. We're so thankful for it. And just working with Adrienne over the years and knowing her and knowing Risk Oversight, I think it's a lot of great and practical knowledge that she's going to bring to the table here. So we're excited that she's recently written a book, and she'll tell us a little bit about that and when it's coming out and what the details are. And that's called the 24-hour rule. But at the core, Adrienne is incredibly passionate about documentation. I actually hired her back in my controller days when I was a controller in the banking and financial services world. I hired her to do documentation there, and I saw her process, and it was practical and tangible, and it got things done. And that's exactly what today is all about, is how can you use the form of communication that's written documentation? How can you use the 24-hour rule, create momentum, and just drive forward as a team? And so really, really looking forward to hearing all of that wisdom. As per usual, if you have questions, please do type them to me, and I'll make sure they get addressed mostly at the end of the session, but maybe I'll interrupt Adrienne every once in a while too. So please send the questions to me and I'll make sure we address them. And in the meantime, Adrienne, thank you, and your chance to chat.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. There's nothing like bringing people together than lease accounting, right, guys? There's a little accounting humor there. Thank you so much to Amplify. I'm a huge fan of Amplify. Am I sharing the right screen, guys? Yes. Okay, they can see the screen.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of Amplify, and they certainly have amplified since those first days. And thank you so much for inviting me here. It's great to speak to you guys. I wish I could see your lovely faces right now, but I will pretend. And I know lunch hour is busy. Many of you are business owners or CPAs or doing a myriad of other things, and you probably have a lot of things to do, but I'm really glad that you've just chosen to talk about the untapped, unsung, unsexy, but not for much longer discipline of documentation for this lunch hour. Okay, let me see. But let's talk about a first world dilemma. Many of you, or all of you, are blessed with access to incredible resources. We have virtually free training out there. Many of you work with really intelligent people. You have opportunities that cross your desk pretty much daily. The problem is we don't always do things with these opportunities. Let's be perfectly honest. In my many years as a consultant, I have watched so many great ideas, intentions, projects just die on the vine, really for almost no apparent reason. I think we can blame the circumstances or resources or other issues, but at the end of the day, we have a lot of processes for bringing information in, but not really great discipline and practice for doing something or taking information out. And this is a challenge that probably many of you see in many places. But when we learn to move on information, that's where we see the magic happen. And that discipline is in fact the art of documentation. So what we're going to be talking about today, I'm going to introduce concepts of the really essential concepts of little d documentation and big D documentation. And that's where we're going to get into the 24-hour rule and other skills and disciplines in the dynamic documentation skill stack. And then I'm going to talk about two kind of applications in our corporate or business world called the 5 stages of documentation, or the 6 steps to solving a documentation problem. We're going to cover a lot of kind of high-level concepts to wrap your head and your arms around this idea of documentation. First, let's get into big D and little d, one of my favorite topics. If you want to excel at documentation, you have to understand what I call big D and little d documentation. While documentation is often thought in our corporate world as big things like policies, processes, knowledge, big systems, big formalized programs, it's in fact a lot more than just that. There is the other side of documentation, which is our everyday little stuff that we do, like our notes, our emails, writing things down, our basic skills of recording, that is just as important. Now, I don't want people to get too stressed about the definition of big D documentation and little d documentation, but at the end of the day, it is the difference between kind of the formalized named documentation, which is our big D stuff, which is often, in the CPA world, this could be audits or risk programs, your project management practice. Those are all, or your enterprise content system. These are all big D concepts, but then there's little d, which are all the other things that actually support big D. I could give examples of accounting systems are just the same, but one very common example, you could buy the best sales system in the world, give it to a team of salespeople who doesn't write things down, and you will not increase your sales by even a dime. That is a little d practice of recording, taking big D systems down. Many people talk about culture eating strategy for breakfast. I say that little d documentation eats big D for lunch. You cannot have successful big D projects without getting these little d concepts right. So for today's presentation, and I do speak about big D and little d, I'm actually going to weight it a lot more on little d practices, just because there's so much already written about big D. I want to give little d a little more respect today. You're probably asking me, what is this thing called documentation that we're talking about anyways? And many of you will have different ideas pop into your mind. We all bring extreme biases to what that word means, and we say it all the time. Documentation is actually at the core of 3 disciplines. There is information management, and that can be as basic as organizing your personal files to as sophisticated as an enterprise-wide content system. That's the art of organizing existing information and documents out there. There's organizational design. That is a huge umbrella term. It covers everything from business analysis to project management. I would argue SOX and internal controls is kind of under that area. Even audits are largely under the process area of your business. And most of our consultants usually use a sexier term for organizational design, like projects, like transformation is really hot. Optimization has been hot in the past, but at the end of the day, you're really just making process better. And then there's the last part of documentation, and this is the most neglected, that is personal productivity. For 1 second, I want you guys to think of an exercise you could do with your team. I want you to ask all your team members next week to write down what they eat, and then you're going to post it on your company intranet. Everything, people are going to send you what they've eaten that week, and we're going to post it on the intranet. Now, if you're in the room, I would ask you what you think their reaction would be. And many people say, well, some people would lie a bit, and some people would be a bit non-compliant, and some people wouldn't like it, and some people would really like it. So, and these are all valid responses. But studies actually show that even asking people to write down what they ate or any other activity actually improves our behavior. Even people lied a bit to you, they would probably eat better that week. That is why documentation works. It actually activates human behavior. It changes our behavior, usually for the better. A little aside, my book, The 24-Hour Rule, actually has the same editor as David Allen's Getting Things Done. Getting Things Done by David Allen, if you haven't read it, it really makes, I love that book. It's a masterpiece on to-do lists, essentially. He makes to-do lists interesting and sexy, just like Marie Kondo makes cleaning and throwing things out sexy. That is actually my goal with documentation, is to make it as sexy and interesting as what these other two authors have done. And the personal productivity section of the bookstore, by the way, now is enormous, but it actually started about 20 years ago with David Allen's first book on Getting Things Done. It's quite an interesting look there. You're probably asking, why am I saying dynamic documentation? Now, I'm not saying it just because it sounds nice together. The word dynamic is very intentional. While documentation has traditionally been viewed as static, probably static files in database or data in databases, files sitting in drawers, data pushed off to your archives, I believe documentation is really the art of moving you forward. Has anyone worked on a team that doesn't write things down? Fortunately, I can't see your faces. Many of you are probably saying, yeah, I have. What happens? Well, what happens is you tend to move in circles. You actually do not move forward. Teams that write things down will move forward. That is the art of documentation being dynamic. Documentation is outcome driven. If I write call mom on my to-do list, am I more likely to do it? Yes, I am. That is, again, the practice of writing things down to drive you forward. Dynamic documentation is based on lean concepts. As a consultant, I've walked into many organizations and they have reams of documents, very complicated documentation systems. I've seen walkthroughs that are 60 pages, not a joke. I've seen testing templates go 50 columns across. I've seen a lot of overkill. This is not what I'm advocating. I'm not advocating perfection in your documentation. It is always done to drive an action, outcome, and momentum forward. And this is the foundation of dynamic documentation. So let's get back to this big D and little d concept. A lot of it, Jamie said, there's a lot of accountants coming. So let's do a little bit of basic math. Now, you probably know if you have a team that doesn't have great little d documentation skills, and you can apply this to many different teams, including accounting, by the way, and then you buy a not so good accounting package, or it doesn't necessarily have to be software. It could be a framework or some big D or policy or some big D concept. You probably know that that will be a fail. If you have a strong team and buy a lousy solution, it's not going to work. For example, I worked with a strong audit team. They bought the wrong software. It didn't work. That's probably quite intuitive. Now, the real challenge that many of you've seen is that a very strong big D solution, including many software products out there, big frameworks that your consultants might be selling, are purchased by companies. Maybe you've seen this yourself in companies. But the teams don't have the little d skills to be successful. My sales example is very common. This actually happens a lot in sales, where sales systems are purchased on the belief that it will solve the little d problems, but it often doesn't. Actually, you can see this in accounting as well, where big solutions are purchased and little d everyday documentation skills or accounting skills are not there to actually sustain the system. I mean, it would be ridiculous to just buy SharePoint without SharePoint skills and say, well, now we've solved our documentation problem. But you actually do see this in companies. So I'm trying to just challenge you lightly about the whole notion of change management, that we can simply buy a great solution throw a bit of change management on it and things will work. Often it's actually building a foundation of strong little d skills that makes big D adoptions more successful. And I have had some challenges, and many of you have probably been in the same boat, of how we traditionally have thought of change management. Sometimes change is really about this foundation. That's why I'm going to keep going over little d skills for today's session. But the ultimate little d skill, let's get into it. The 24-hour rule. That's probably why you came today. Now, you can forget everything you hear at all these wonderful Amplify sessions, but if you only remember the 24-hour rule, I swear you'll get all the benefit from all these lunches sitting at the AHA. Now, no offense to Jamie's great sessions. I promise you, this is the golden rule of documentation. It's also will make you a productivity superstar as well. But first, let's do a little hypothetical scenario. This is one of the most important business cases you will do for a long time, by the way. You can forget what you've done at your MBA or CPA courses. Let's imagine you have a really important meeting with a key client, or it could be your leadership team, or maybe it's your boss or your boss's boss. You've been trying for a very long time to get this meeting, but the only time you can get this meeting is the Friday before the long weekend at 3:30. So that is the last slot available in your client or boss's schedule. So you have this meeting, you prepare quite diligently for it. It ends up being a fantastic meeting. You are leaving on a high note. You're seeing your career go forward. You're seeing yourself getting the next contract with this client. Whatever it is, you're seeing success out of this meeting and the outcomes. Now, I'll give you a few more details from this meeting. First, let's remember it is a senior person. The content is pretty technical from the meeting, and it is nuanced. And it is also slightly different from what you're already doing. I'm just going to throw a few case facts in here. But then after this meeting, it's 4:30 and you check your watch and say, oh, geez, I got to run. My spouse is picking me up, or my friends are picking me up. We are going away for the long weekend. So you run downstairs and, you head out with your spouse or your friends. You're going to the airport, or you're going, maybe you're going to Windermere or Banff for the weekend. And you end up having a fantastic long weekend away, lots of good times, lots of fun. You get back to work on Tuesday morning, and you have a few kind of silly update meetings. You tell your coworkers about your weekend. You answer a few emails, and before you know it, it's 3:30. It's almost, the whole day is almost gone by on that Tuesday after getting back. And then you think, oh gosh, I've got to get to these notes. Now, if I could see your faces, I would ask you, what do you think happens? Now, if you remember maybe some basic facts from this little case study, the person you're meeting with is more senior. So probably remember, if you hadn't reprocessed your notes, you probably weren't typing, and you probably didn't write with your head down like this. The information was reasonably technical. It was nuanced, which means there's different intention coming from the person you're talking to. And it's also slightly new area. If you have a human brain, you will probably not be able to remember, even if you have some chicken scratch notes, as well as you would have liked to, if you did not revisit in that whole span of the long weekend. That's about 100 hours have gone by. And if you have been in this situation, and sometimes it's not a long weekend, sometimes you run a really critical meeting on Monday, and then you're just slammed and you don't get time to process it until Friday. And then you reflect. If you've been in that situation, you are completely not alone. We do not, in fact, talk about this situation enough at work, and it is hurting our productivity. I've given this presentation to various groups, including senior partners, business owners, successful leaders, people at all stages of their career, and they can recall making that mistake a couple times. And I've still made that mistake even after writing the 24-hour rule, by the way. I wrote the 24-hour rule because I've made that mistake many times in my own career. Many of you as probably young CPAs, it's actually the challenge is even worse at the beginning of your career when information is more technical and you are more junior and things are much newer. So here is, drum roll please, the 24-hour rule. This is the only rule you have to remember from all of your AHA Amplify sessions, is that you need to rethink, reprocess, or rewrite information within 24 hours of hearing it. Or simply, you just need to do something with information within 24 hours before, poof, your short-term memory lets it go. So let's explore a little bit more what this means. Your brain, these are some scary facts here, only has room for 7 Post-it notes. Now, this is a really important thing to remember when it comes to documentation. 7 Post-it notes are really essentially slots in your memory bank to store short-term information. So if you think of all the things you have going on at work and outside of work and with your family, 7 Post-it notes is not a heck of a lot of space. Let's be honest. And you could also think of the short-term memory bank like a whiteboard, but it has fading ink. So in about 24 hours, the ink on your mental whiteboard actually starts to fade, and you cannot recall it as well as you can past that 24-hour window. I'll give you another scary statistic. The human attention span is now, since the onslaught of the iPhone, is now shorter than that of a goldfish. We used to be around 12 seconds, but we're actually closer to about 8, and a goldfish is around 9. So really, we are struggling to pay attention nowadays, guys. And let me throw another fact on this. We actually only listen to 50% of information we hear. The other 50% is almost gone. So we put all these scary concepts together. You really need to know, really comes to roost that you need a system for getting good at capturing the information that comes into those 24-hour windows in your day and making sense of it. So who has something on their to-do list that has just sat there for the last 2 weeks, and for the love of God, you just can't seem to get to it? Oh, I can't see anyone's faces right now, but most people do, let's face it. We are not that good at processing things past a 24-hour window. We are actually quite good. You probably had something else come onto your to-do list that you attacked in record speed. That again, 24 hours is our optimal time of processing information. I'm sure you've been sitting at work one day and your fingers drift off and you start Googling what you watched on Netflix last night, or certainly the hockey games with that going on right now. That is a common challenge. Your brain is actually processing the last 24 hours. I'm only saying this to illustrate how much your brain does process the last 24 hours and how we have that energetic connection. Now, I'm not saying we can necessarily act on everything in 24 hours, but if you can, you are activating the natural energetic connection of the human brain. If you think of a factory and there are widgets coming on it and the incoming belt is going at full speed, but the outgoing belt is broken, that's a problem. You're going to have a jam. I see this as almost the way our modern to-do lists are growing. We have so many meetings, seminars, things we go to collect more and more stuff, but very little systems or talk about the systems to actually push that information out. If you can attack things in that window, you will shorten some of the jam that you will get in that kind of natural flow of information coming in our day. Most of us do this quite naturally now. But to develop your consciousness even further will accelerate your productivity, because you are activating the ability to act on things in a short window to avoid that pileup that we see in our corporate world, and even business owners. We all struggle with the same idea of just more and more getting absorbed without the ability to push it out. The 24-hour rule is a superpower. If you can do something with information within 24 hours of hearing it, you will accelerate to the ranks of super producer. But it's not a perfect system. I am not saying that I can activate as much as I'd like in the 24-hour window, but I still make that effort to maximize personal productivity and the ability to leverage the energetic connection you have with information, and also overcome the short-term memory limitations of the human brain. If you can do as much as you can to reprocess, you will accelerate. I do promise you, I've had friends that have used the 24-hour rule, and it has helped them get a hold of reality, take faster action, avoid perfectionism, and get momentum on their day, and to avoid that pileup. I do promise you that adopting some of these concepts will help you in your personal life. And this is more than just helping your documentation. It'll help that too, but it'll really help you mentally as well. A few quick tips. I'm not advocating that you take copious notes and rewrite everything, but the ability to take simple recaps on information will be very powerful for your when you go to meetings and you write down a few bullets to recap what you heard and you take a bit of action, will be extremely powerful. If you can use the 24-hour rule to help plan your day, sometimes back to back meetings is actually will hurt your productivity. Sometimes you need that space to process information, or you just don't get the energetic connection that we need to actually be successful and to learn how to act and move information to make it truly dynamic. Again, and do pay attention to the limitations of your short-term memory. Even if you can't quite get to everything in 24 hours, if you can at least be very cognizant that I'm not really going to remember Monday's meeting very well by today or tomorrow. So I'm going to do as much as I can to act on it and put it at the top of my queue to actually get momentum on it. And I could certainly go over many tips, but it's really the ability to recap and the ability to plan and the ability to think about the short-term memory. You'll see many little changes in your productivity, and actually I hope even in your mental well-being and ability to make your team more successful as well. Let's talk a little bit about the dynamic documentation skill stack. There's a lot we can talk to here, but I am going to just hit on some high points. Really, if you get the 24-hour rule right, the rest will come easily. If the 24-hour rule can be applied to stuff like meeting notes, like in the sales example, certainly you could write down notes, get them somewhere, interviews, all that stuff will help a lot for improve your documentation. But there's a few more skills that'll also help. And I'm not going to get into everything, but documentation is not a skill like breathing. It is actually difficult to find people who are great at documentation. As a business owner, I can tell you that people with identical resumes can have dramatically different documentation skills. It is an underappreciated, underlooked for skill set in today's workforce, but it is growing in importance with today's knowledge-based economy and the ability to really get leverage and get all those intellectual jewels out of people's heads and onto paper and onto a format that we can actually use and build great things. The art of interviewing might not sound like a documentation skill, but it is absolutely essential. You need to be able to take information out of people's heads to solve whatever documentation problem you are looking on. In my personal experience, I have seen interviews are the best way to create documents, to solve problems, and to cut through a lot of noise. I know a lot of consultants, they like big meetings and big fancy workshops, and those do have a purpose, but the actual stuff you create is often the one-on-one connection is the best way to solve it. I have an example with, I was working with a team and they were trying to solve this complicated project using very big meetings. And I entered and I said, geez, this is not going to work. We have to move to interviews. Just moving to interviews within 2 weeks, we were actually able to see very clearly what the solution was. I'm not saying this to sell one solution over the other. Really, people share better and the ability to capture notes through great techniques. And my advice on getting great at interviewing is that you need to balance structure with a bit of spontaneity. You think of Jimmy Kimmel or Oprah. They are actually the masters at the interview. They're paid mega bucks to do this. You too can be a great interviewer to support your documentation through the ability to have some structure and know where you're going, but the ability to actually connect and draw information out of people. Note taking, I could talk the whole section on notes. Note taking is very much attached to the 24-hour rule, by the way. Our ability to recap notes and to kind of think about what we heard, rewrite it is hugely connected. If you practice the 24-hour rule, it will naturally improve your ability to take notes, and not actually how you write it during the meeting, but how you get better at synthesizing information after. This is a simple kind of different quadrants that you can consider in your own note-taking style. There are two styles that I'll get into, the spotlight and the floodlight method. And you can also consider pen and paper or technology driven. I know this looks really simplistic and you're probably saying this is really old school to even talk about pen and paper. There are studies after studies that show that comprehension is usually better through pen and paper. And there are times where you need to take pen and paper. Myself personally, I actually use a combination of all these techniques and a lot of 24-hour rule type of recapping to write back. And that combination has helped me enormously in my note-taking style. And the point with this is to show that different situations will compel you to take notes differently. For example, if I'm meeting with someone quite senior, maybe I'm a bit old school, but generally having a laptop up in front of me, I find a little inappropriate. If I'm meeting with someone maybe a little less senior, your coworker, no problem, no, laptop is fine. If you are really aiming for comprehension, you will go more for a pen and paper style versus if you're doing more of an update type of meeting, a computer usually works better. But anyhow, it's important to think of the different quadrants and when they work best. Let me just talk quickly about spotlight versus floodlight. Spotlight is actually how most of you probably naturally take notes, is that your brain is looking for things quite naturally in a meeting, and you will write down what is relevant for you. This is actually how the human attention span works. My method is the human attention span is either looking for something. If we're thinking about something, our brain will scan the environment for it, or it can go broad, where our attention span can actually have that as well. Spotlight method just means you go in and write a few concepts down. Floodlight style is about writing down almost like a stream of talking with more of an open mind. This is a technique you use a little more when you're junior, but anyone can do this. We all have times in our career where we walk into a new client or a new industry, or we're going to a conference on something new, and we don't know where it's going. We don't know what this information will lend to us, and we kind of write almost like a stream of talking. That actually will help your comprehension. It sounds like kind of a ridiculous method, but actually can help especially when you're thrown into new situations. And then when you have the 24-hour rule, it will help you to practice recapping and synthesizing that information to make sense of it. That combination can be wonderful for helping to get up to speed on new things you're working on. Does anyone have this little guy running around their organization? Has anyone had the exact same conversation that you swear you had the week before, or heard the same conversation about 10 different times in your organization? Or else experienced deja vu? Now, most of us have had this situation many times at work. I call these Groundhog Day issues, which means you're literally reliving the same meeting over and over again. And my belief is that documentation is absolutely about the solution for getting rid of groundhogs. I call it a groundhog trap. One of the best groundhog traps out there is dynamic reporting. Now, many of you, if you're CPAs, you might have a very formal big D idea of reporting. But reporting really, to me, is just about saying what we're thinking and getting comfortable with your team, writing down things that they want to communicate and get out of their brains. I actually think we don't share enough what people, I think we have a very educated workforce, but we often don't get that education onto paper as much as we can, so we can't do as much with it. I'll give you an example of this is very simple example from my own work. I was having a groundhog meeting with my team. At one of my clients, we would discuss getting a communication tool. Almost every month we'd have the exact same conversation. So I threw in an email kind of explaining the need for the tool to the VP, and it was sort of written like a memo, and we got it immediately. That is an example of a simple groundhog trap to get rid of the groundhogs of recurring conversations. A very interesting example when it comes to reporting is Jeff Bezos. When he was growing Amazon, he actually hated PowerPoint. One technique he used with his team to get ideas brought forward from all levels was a really old school technique, the memo. He would have team members write a memo on what they thought on their ideas, and the memos would be distributed before meetings, and team members would sit in silence and read these memos, and then the meeting would start and they discuss the idea. So I actually think this is a brilliant idea. This is allowing people to voice their opinion on paper, and actually remove some of the bias that comes out of large group meetings. So a technique that I think works very well is just called the what's working or not working memo. It doesn't have to be a memo, it could be bullet notes. But even with my own business, we hire people of great experience, but sometimes people are not used to saying what they believe is working or not. And I think this is actually, we need to give opinions, even if they're preliminary, on how, and tell people how we're thinking so that we can leverage the knowledge in our own lives and our teams. Let's talk a little bit about human workflow. And we already talked about the 24-hour rule, which is an essential part of your everyday ongoing workflow. The workflow that I think is super interesting has nothing to do with SAP or TQM or SharePoint. It's actually the ability to move everyday information and documents and to-dos our human capacity for it. It's a very individual thing. And we have some best practices out there. It's actually not talked a lot about in the corporate world, but it's something that is essential for great documentation, by the way. The documentation is the ability to actually workflow ourselves personally and move that to our teams and our organizations, and the ability to kind of act on information in a systematic manner. I am a bit of a productivity junkie, and I have read a lot of different productivity experts, and I think it comes down to a few core codes, by the way. These codes will help you with documentation, but everything you're working on. The code, if you think of code in a workflow of a system, that happens automatically. Now for ourselves, I actually think we need a series of codes that we draw on depending on the situation. Dripping is a code that means you do a bit of everything every day. So the book I wrote is not a very impressive project because it took me like 7 years. I wrote like a little bit every day with my schedule. You could achieve a lot of things doing really little things every day. Sticking is actually the most efficient way of working. If you will not get up until I'm done this stupid report, that is the most efficient. Of course, we have a lot of other things to balance with that, don't get me wrong, but it's actually the most efficient. If you can use that code. Batching is about grouping tasks strategically. So the superstar Adam Grant, he actually writes books during some months of the year, and he teaches during other months of the year to exercise batching, because strategic groups of tasks are more efficient when they're done together. Chunking is about working in little spurts, like interval training. I think this is huge in documentation. We need to work in spurts. We're sprinters, not necessarily marathoners. Working in 20 to 30 minutes chunks is great for getting work done. And then the last technique is just doing. Sometimes that is a code you need to do. It's like, screw the planning to-do listing and just go for it. A book I really like is called The 5-Second Rule. It's a little different than 24-hour rule. The 5-second rule is not necessarily about information processing. It is about taking action and getting out of our own way to push things forward. That's Mel Robbins' book. Also a great book if you're actually struggling with that just doing. So I am going to talk super briefly. We're almost out of time. I'm going to give you 2 big D concepts that, now that you've learned a bunch of little d ideas, these are 2 kind of big D frameworks that you can use. The first one is the 5 stages of documentation. Very simple. In my extensive experience looking at different companies are usually in 5 different stages. Stage 1 or stage 2 is when they're kind of growing, where they have no documentation or a bit of documentation. This could be a new business. It actually could be a new division or a new big project under a big company as well. Stage 3, now many of you have probably seen stage 3. Stage 3 is actually very common. That's where people kind of go through the motions with documentation. Oh, we're documenting because the auditor said so. Oh, we're doing it because of SOX. Who hasn't heard that before? People are not really thinking of documentation as a dynamic concept. This is probably where I see most of my clients, especially when I first start working with them, is that they are stage 3. They sort of do it because they have to, but really are not seeing the benefit. And by the way, I do think stage 3, to get out of it to stage 4, which is optimize, it's always about the little d skills, intuition, and discipline that lifts you into the optimize. Stage 4, now that is the ideal stage. That's where we all aspire to be. It's where documentation adds value. People are talking about it. It makes decisions. It drives you forward. It does not mean you need every little document to be absolutely perfect. That is not the intention of great documentation. It is just means that you are using things to drive you forward. If you or if people are genuinely using your information and they can understand it, engage with it, and it is actually changing things for the better, that is a sign of stage 4 optimize. And then, we've got the last bucket, stage 5 overkill. If you had a consultant that sold you a Ferrari when all you need was a bicycle, if you are drowning in complicated systems or have super lengthy documentation, or you've given all your documentation work to detailed people. Now, there's no offense to detailed people, but there are a lot of detailed people in the documentation space. You might be in stage 5, which is the overkill zone. This stage is also very common, especially for public companies in my own travels. You do need to watch out for the overkill zone. If you think of all these things I've talked about documentation being truly dynamic and connected with outcome, overkilling things will actually take you away from pushing things forward. And it is one of the harder, I've certainly worked with a lot of people in the overkill bucket, but it is one of the, actually can be harder to turn people around, especially when systems are overly complex, or we have to tell clients that this documentation is hurting you, not helping you, because it's just not going the direction you need. So in my little homework for you is to think about what stage you believe your organization or your team is at, and think about what little D skills and capacities can get you to stage 4 optimized. And then the last concept I'm just going to drop very quickly is that I do believe documentation is not some shelf exercise. It is absolutely an art of solving problems. The technique of documentation can help you no matter what. Really, most corporate problems or small business problems are effectively documentation problems. If your team can't find anyone, you're stuck in a vortex of meeting, you're going public, you've hired a top consulting firm, but you haven't seen any results. You're pulling your hair out trying to get people to document, or you have information stuck in people's head and not really adding any value. These are all actually documentation problems. The last kind of concept that I want to talk you through very briefly is these 6 steps for solving your business problem. If I had more time, I could my book is actually structured around these 6 steps. There are skills, there are little D skills and big D concepts that you need to understand at each of these 6 steps. Capture, actually, we've talked a lot about capture today, because capture is the start. We can't even talk about documentation unless you have the fundamental skills of getting information out of people's heads through meetings, through notes, through the 24-hour rule. Structuring is the art of doing something with information, not just collecting for the sake of collecting. Presenting is making it look great, and also great writing. Communicating is pushing it out so it adds value. Store and leveraging. Now, store and leveraging, you probably heard quite a bit about. If you go, people actually say to me, "Oh, you're a documentation expert? Okay, so what system do you use? Where do you store?" Generally, assumption is that you're only focused on store and leverage, but that is actually a misconception. Documentation is actually a lot broader, and the problems I see in companies are usually not just in storage and leverage. That's only one piece of the broader puzzle. And lead and innovate is how you do something with documentation. I would even argue that getting rid of groundhogs is a leadership concept, using the art of great documentation to drive you forward as a leader. You don't need a title of a leader, as long as you can put things on paper to get people to agree, make decisions, and move forward. And I will say that you can diagnose some of the documentation problems that your company might be facing a little bit through looking at these 6 steps. For example, if you are stuck in a vortex in meeting and your team has lots of ideas, but they don't seem to be going anywhere. That can be a capturing problem. It could be actually a structuring problem where people don't know how to actually push things forward. If you have documentation that is technically excellent, but no one really engages with it, they find it kind of boring. Like you have a 400-page onboarding package that no one reads or something like that. That can actually be a presenting problem where you don't have the skills and the skill stack to make documentation appealing and in the eyes of your users. Store and leveraging, again, can be just, you can't find things. If I had a little more time, we could certainly talk through all these different ways that you can diagnose the problem and solve it through thinking of those 6 steps and complementing it with some of the little d skills. And there's many little d skills that unfortunately I didn't get to today, but I gave you a teaser of some of the ones I think you should experiment with. As my little gift to you, I have more information that, because I didn't really get into the corporate side, I have a download that actually might help you to kind of, you could work through some documentation concepts, and it'll actually be very helpful if you're looking to kind of improve documentation in certain areas, and it'll give you a little bit of information that I didn't cover in today's presentation, because there is a lot. I am throwing a lot of concepts at you over one lunch hour. But thank you so much for having me. If you need any more information, I have a newsletter called, this reasonably new, called Leverage Your Knowledge, and it is actually about getting more knowledge out of your and your team's heads to making use of it. And I have another newsletter that I do that about every 2 months on some documentation best practices. So I would love to send you any more information. And my book is coming out early next year called it's from Ben Bella, which and distributed by Random House. So really exciting. So I hope to give you more information in the future. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me. I'd love to help you.
Awesome. Thank you, Adrienne. So we do have some questions that I want to ask you about. So one of the questions that came through is, if you were to add this to your daily task list, how much time would you allocate, assuming that you have 6 or 7 hours of meetings per day? So that's an interesting question in the sense that all of us have too many meetings to begin with, clearly. Yeah. And so how do we add this, which can be overwhelming in some ways because it's asking us to do more or add something to our list or our to-do. And I anticipate that your answer is going to be that for the extra work you do, you actually save time in the long run by that.
You guessing my answer?
I'm guessing your answer, but please enlighten us. How much time would we have to put in place to begin with when we're getting the practice, and then what is the long-term outcome?
So I will fully admit, like, the 24-hour rule is not like, as I said, it's a superpower, but it's not perfect. But what is really a shame in today's work world is when you see people bounce meeting to meeting, conference to conference, sales call to sales call. Jamie, I'm sure you see this, like, you know how busy we do get, but we actually don't do anything with that information. That is a tragedy. I actually, as I mentioned, I don't think we have a challenge of getting more in our day. There are so many great things out there. I think we do have a challenge. Certainly the clients I work with, my own, like, it's always about acting on what we've done. So I will say that is the real tragedy I see, is when people bounce meeting to meeting and nothing ever happens. And then you have another Groundhog Day meeting. That is a problem we actually don't talk about enough. And great documentation discipline can help to alleviate that. If you are stuck 6 hours, of course, we have lots of executives, business owners here. 6 hours a day is a lot of people do. I can't probably get you out of those 6 hours of meetings. The 3-bullet recap is what I would recommend the most, is that even if you can recap for 5 minutes what you heard in 3 bullets, you will actually be ahead, because you will develop almost like a long-term skill of synthesis and the ability to really cut to the chase of what you heard. That is, expand, it will help it could help documentation if you're someone like me who creates a lot and helps to organize and give systems around documentation, but it just helps your own like to-do list and natural building of whatever you're working on, because you'll almost have this own personal knowledge base of what you've heard. So if you could do the 3-bullet recap, even if it takes you 5 minutes, it might sound silly, but that is enormously valuable, especially when you consider how much we forget. If you're sitting in 6 hours of meetings a day, I guarantee you're not going to remember that much. So a few bullets, it can help. If you can take 5 minutes of action on, like we had this meeting, and I'm going to take 5 minutes of action after it. It really does help get momentum in your day. I would actually say I can be less productive in my busy season because I'm actually too stacked to take advantage of that natural momentum that comes in 24 hours. Although you'd think the busier you get, you probably should be faster. And I definitely see a sharp decline. And I'm very attuned to trying to leverage that natural momentum.
Yeah, those are good points for sure. It's interesting because at Amplify, one of the things that we did, which isn't the 24-hour rule necessarily, but we did introduce Flex Friday, partially so people could get
time, absolutely,
but also so that they could have a non-interruptive day and get into flow and have some follow-up. So obviously, could be if the meeting happens Monday, it's certainly not the best practice you're talking about, but it does provide some sheltered time. And I think we can all do that. Like, I know for many years, I tend to not take meetings outside of 9 to 4 unless it's strategically necessary.
Absolutely.
And we see a lot of that too, where people will get that follow-up time, pre 9 a.m. or post 4 p.m. And when you get to a certain level, I mean, it would be beautiful, I guess, to fit it all into 8 hours, but it often does have to extend into that earlier morning or later or early evening as well, right? So those are sheltered times that you could actually spend doing this. And, obviously not quite best practice in the sense of like immediately after a meeting, but at least it's a dedicated time and
yeah. And some, you don't necessarily have to, I mean, I go to a lot of meetings with clients. That's really a large part of what I do is get information out of people's brains. I don't have time. I like to do a good job on our notes because it actually feeds so much what we work on is that synthesis. But even if I can just kind of recap it quickly, like 3-bullet recap, or, sometimes I retype it because I do take a lot of handwritten for the stuff I'm really hired for comprehension and for problem solving, to just even take 5 minutes on it. And let's say I do a lot of processing on Sundays. I work all day Sundays to process, but like if I've at least the 24-hour rule is not doing it perfectly. It's just rethinking it like, okay, these are the 3 things. I'm going to quickly address it. And then I'll get to finalizing it on Friday or Sunday, whenever. But what you're saying, Jamie, is absolutely needed in today's culture. If we don't have that processing time, things do fall off the rails.
And when you think about that 3-bullet recap, Adrian, is that more about you and your ability for follow-up, or is that about, assisting and helping those that attended the meeting? Because the skeptic in me is that the same person who's not going to do follow-up isn't going to read your recap anyways, right? And so, so is it really about how you can do more and be more productive and have better follow-up and better documentation when you think about those 3-bullet recaps, or is that about helping your whole team?
So I typically think selfishly. Now this sounds, well, it is both, but hear me out on a selfish note. It's about our ability to say, that's what I got out of it. Like if I'm in sales, let's say you're selling to if I listening to a new client and you're really hearing to what they say, you might think, oh, geez, okay, they need this, this, and this. It's not even, you're actually activating the art of what was key out of that meeting. So I'm being a little selfish in it can certainly transcend. Let's say you went to a sales meeting and then you thought of 3 bullets and then you communicated to Jesse, that would be great. But it's really about getting great at synthesis. We sometimes in our run and gun world, we can all relate that we're literally like, I'm headed to my next meeting. I'm sure most of us are getting off this call and jumping to our next meeting. Maybe people have really great feedback for me or something like that. And I'm headed. It's about really, really getting great at synthesis, and synthesis actually drives better documentation systems and better documentation across the board and better productivity. It's not, yeah. So that is what I was thinking, but it transcends to both.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I mentioned this on LinkedIn, and I'm curious to know your perspective. So, you're an executive, you're a business leader, you're a team lead, and you're keeping yourself dedicated and disciplined to your rocks or your priorities or whatever you call them, right? So you've got, say, 3 priorities or 3 rocks for the quarter. And those are big, those are big movements, they're big achievements, but you also have your day job or just, getting shit done type of work. And so how does a person, attend these meetings and take this 24-hour rule where they're getting stuff done quick and moving things and following through without sacrificing those rocks and priorities, like the balance of, if you have the time, should you be following up on the 4 meetings that you had today, or should you be dedicating it towards moving the needle on those rocks and priorities? And how does the person use the 24-hour rule and dynamic documentation to strike the balance there?
Yeah, well, usually little meetings are connected to bigger goals. Like if I think the 24-hour rule is about, okay, if I have sales again, I keep using sales, but it's just an easy example. I want to grow my sales. I want to grow my sales by $1 million. So I'm going to these sales meetings. I mean, you're usually connected to a bigger goal. So your ability to act on 24-hour increments will improve your ability to achieve the bigger goal. It's that simple. I mean, usually what you do in 24 hours is all about usually connected to that bigger goal. You're right that we have, when I ask people, of course I can't see their faces, does anyone have something on their to-do list that has just sat there for 2 weeks and you can't get to, for some reason you just can't? And we've all been through that, like, oh, I'll get to that tomorrow, why is that just sitting there? Things get harder and harder to action after 24 hours. Of course, we're going to have that kind of running total of, I will call them almost more difficult stuff to attack. And that is almost like another bucket. I actually am a little different than a lot of productivity people in that if we actually can exercise the natural momentum of, and we are, and I'm not a scientist, but I've certainly looked up as much as I can on the human brain processing and memory. If we can do a little, alleviate that pile up through taking some of that stuff out, it's almost like a LIFO or FIFO system. It's really nerdy, but we're kind of taught FIFO, where we accumulate stuff and then attack it in the order it comes in. I'm almost suggesting a slight bit of LIFO, where you have to act on things also in that 24 hours to alleviate a bit of that pile up, because our productivity practices that we're kind of taught to just keep growing the to-do list is not always working. It's not, and we're not actually getting, it's growing to kind of unreasonable levels with a lot of people. And I do think that's actually hurting mental health. I mean, that's a whole other conversation, but to at least take some of that like out of the high priority queue. I wouldn't say they're high. I would say the 24-hour rule is almost like a different queue from your kind of stuff that you have to get to, but it's kind of sitting on that. I'll call it the 2-week list that we all have a little bit of that stuff we can't get to. Yeah. I don't have a perfect system, but I do think people have to take it seriously. Their ability, they are faster in that 24-hour window, and they actually can recall it. So it's a bit of a balance. Definitely, right. It is a balance. No one's going to strike it perfect, for sure. No, it's not about perfection. Please don't aim for perfection. That is. Yeah, which actually
to my next question, if you're surrounded by entrepreneurs and business leaders and CPAs that have a tendency for perfection, and we all see it in ourselves and definitely around us, where there's we're paralyzed by the need for perfection, and the some of the concepts that you were mentioning, like the drip approach and the chunking and just doing, can be very give people a really gross feeling in their stomach, because one could assume that if it's a drip approach, it's not going to be perfect, right? Then are you vulnerable and exposed, and people are going to see something that's less than perfect? And how do you help people tackle that? I mean, even documentation, like a perfect document is almost impossible to achieve because it's so audience dependent. And are you using it as a training manual or for SOX compliance or for refreshers? And if you're trying to make one document good for everybody, then it's going to have a little bit less than perfection, right? So how do you help people with these concepts when they're fighting against that need for perfectionism?
Oh, perfectionism's like another huge topic. Okay, so absolutely. Perfectionism is actually, I have a recent blog out that on perfection. I think there is a balance between perfectionism and winging it. And that's actually my topic, is that perfectionism works. It's like salt. I think our default stance should actually be to wing it. Now, wing it is not a negative. It means you are always doing things to force momentum and push it forward. For most work in the corporate world, I'm not saying for brain surgery, if you're a nuclear physicist, but most of the work I do is it's about, now winging it sounds negative, but it is about literally being someone who pushes things forward. Perfectionism does have a place. We should dash perfectionism like salt on things, because you do want your work to have wow factor. You do want to remember, we generally want to be remembered for things. But if you think about your work in a year, it might come down to a handful of things that you did that really, where people really saw that perfection. You don't need to organize your paper clips perfectly, but you might do a dash of perfectionism for a certain presentation, for certain book or report you're doing, something that has, so that actually is that applies to documentation. And certainly that overkill bucket that I talked about is a real challenge. Actually, a lot of larger organizations where we do have a lot of perfectionists, especially in the documentation space and the CPA space, always looking for that perfect diagram, that perfect process that doesn't really exist. But yes, my main advice is, in general, use dynamic or get it done. Sprinkle perfectionism to up any type of work you're working on. And it's usually in strategic areas. It could be in your review, something you really want people to remember, to use your skills, talents wisely, and your energy wisely. Because
yeah, no, that's a great analogy of the salt, sprinkling in the perfection to get that wow factor. That's a really tangible goal that we could set, as opposed to being paralyzed by always trying to make everything perfect and then not starting or getting that momentum or getting things done because you don't have the ability to make it perfect. So then you keep it on that to-do list, and it builds up, as you said, it builds up and builds up and builds up. And so that's a really good reminder. If anyone has any other questions, please do ask. We're going to wrap up pretty quick. I do have one last story slash question, Adrian. So I was telling the group at our weekly Tuesday meeting earlier this morning that I had a chance on the weekend to golf 19 holes, but as a classic business owner slash working mom, those 19 holes were actually increments of 9 holes, 5 holes, and 5 holes. And yet there's so many husbands out there that unless they can golf 18 holes plus have a steak after, they don't bother, right? And I think for those of us that are working moms or business owners or business leaders, we know that if your goal is always everything, or from a consulting language, maybe it's, can you move the needle without boiling the ocean? And obviously in that example, I did move the needle. I had good opportunities to hang out with 3 different people while we did the few holes we could fit in, and it was great conversation. I got good steps in, and that's a hell of a lot better than just saying, okay, I don't have time for 18, so I'm not going to golf Friday. I don't have time for 18, so I'm not going to golf Saturday. I don't have time for 18, so I'm not going to golf Sunday. And then I would be telling you that I golf 0, and I didn't connect with any of those people, and I didn't get any steps in because I probably wouldn't have had time to walk the dog either, right? And so it's just an example of, we go back to consulting, it's like, can you move the needle without boiling the ocean? And when you were talking about drip, it's I think it's something that a lot of us don't do enough, because we don't feel like we're going to get enough of an impact. And it goes back to perfectionism too. We're not going to get enough of an impact, or we're not going to finish it through or see it through. So therefore it stays on the list. So maybe just from a closing perspective, any examples or stories you want to tell, just that how drip has made a difference, and maybe just even expanding on the comment that, 7 years to write a book. But there's a lot of us that would sit there and say, okay, today is May 17th. I'm going to start writing a book today, and I'm going to finish it in 2029. And that would stop a lot of people from even starting.
Yeah.
A lot of people, like 98% of people, knowing that they're going to finish the book in 2029, whatever, would just mean, okay, I'm not going to bother, right? But yet here you are with really reputable publishers and distributors, and you've been traveling even in this COVID world. Like, tell us a bit about how it can make a difference, even though when you're starting and it's drip, that it can feel like it's not worth it.
Oh, geez. Well, don't write a book if you for the money or anything. It's a lot of work. Aside, the motivation for writing the book is that documentation is under talked about. And it's a massive area. In my travels, in the CPA profession, and actually every other profession, by the way, that I talk to, the training is very dull. Let's be honest. Well, I'm sure I can speak among friends here that basically given kind of templates or told what to do, go fill in this audit report, go fill in this thing. That's actually not an engaging way to talk about documentations. I've actually been hugely motivated to change the conversation. And that's kind of been what kept me writing about it for so long. This is one goal I had that drip worked. Another one, I don't golf anymore. I'm actually really terrible at staying in shape. I work out for like 10 minutes a day. That's actually helping me. There's strange, and I have a personal trainer who talks about how, you can actually stay in okay shape in 10 minutes. I mean, and you'd be a little shocked. I thought that's not great shape, but she's actually, you'd be surprised. I think drip is a fascinating concept. It's big in the productivity space. Atomic Habits, I don't know if you've read it, is all about drip. He's like making very tiny changes in your life. The 24-hour rule, you might not practice it completely, but the discipline of actually recapping mentally, even 5 minutes a day to reprocess the day before, can have actually huge impact on your ability, your processing ability, and your ability to kind of get a hold of what you heard in the last 24 hours and to really leverage your knowledge better for the future. So I would end on that note, that if you can drip, even if most of us don't practice 24-hour rule perfectly, 5 minutes a day to reflect on the day before, I do guarantee it'll have large impact now and in the future too.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us. That's a wrap. And we appreciated hearing everything you had to say about dynamic documentation and the 24-hour rule. Thanks so much.